In his film, The Mechanical Correlates of Motricity, ConferenceReport correctly argues that there probably is not one unique attribute that identifies, defines, and constitutes consciousness. He also argues that what we call consciousness is a collection of processes and properties that are presumably, for him, brain-related. Then ConferenceReport effectively argues that if we were to explain each of the processes of consciousness and the properties of consciousness, like memory, perception, etc., it would then be illegitimate to ask, but what is consciousness? ConferenceReport makes an analogy. He argues just as it would be illegitimate to ask, what is the motricity of a car, after one has received all the explanations of the car's parts and the scientific principles it employs, so it is illegitimate to ask, what is consciousness, after one has received all the explanations of its constituent parts and processes. In effect, ConferenceReport is saying that it is a kind of category mistake to attribute an ontological status to consciousness that is in any way not reducible to its constituent brain parts and processes. It appears then that for ConferenceReport, the term consciousness is a kind of convenient fiction employed to talk about these brain parts and processes. Now, unless I misunderstood something in ConferenceReport's video, it seems to me that descriptions of consciousness's constituent parts and processes, individually and severably considered, are insufficient to explain the experience of consciousness, or what we call consciousness. It seems that to get anything approaching an adequate explanation of consciousness, we would need additional explanations about how these brain processes and parts function together to create the experience of consciousness and what we properly call to be conscious. That might, and only just might, put us in a discussion of how consciousness is an emergent property of the functioning of these brain parts and processes. And for some people, for reasons I don't completely understand, discussions of emergent properties are too spooky. Here is another reason why I think ConferenceReport's argument fails. If it is illegitimate to ask what is consciousness, because to do so is some kind of category mistake, it would be equally illegitimate to argue that rudimentary life forms lack consciousness. One cannot properly lack what is absurd to attribute to any being. Yet, it's not absurd to attribute consciousness to higher life forms and to not attribute it to rudimentary life forms. For example, it's meaningful to ask, is he conscious about a severely head-injured human being, but not about a traumatized amoeba? Just because the answer to the question, what is consciousness, is complex and multivalent, and presently far beyond our science to answer, it hardly follows that the question itself, what is consciousness, is inappropriate and illogical. So instead of declaring some questions and concepts as absurd because they are beyond us, we should instead eat a little humble pie and admit that we are, at present, just too stupid to answer the questions and define the concepts. Thank you.